Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Just ahead of the G20 summit in Hangzhou, more than 800 business community representatives have been attending the B20 summit to come up with policy recommendations for the G20 leaders. At the opening ceremony of the B20 summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping urged the G20 to prescribe remedies for world economic woes. So what remedies might they come up with? What items were topping the B20 agenda? And how will it contribute to the G20 agenda? To discuss all this and more, today I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Zhu Ning, Deputy Director of the Advanced Institute of Finance at the Shanghai Jiaotong University, and Mr. He Weiwen, Senior Fellow of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. Also, Mr. Roy Chen, on the board of global law firm DLA Pepper, will join us via satellite in Hangzhou. Before we get started, let's take a look at this.
The B20 recommendations can be broken down into 4 key phrases. 1. Break a new path for global economic growth. 2. Develop more effective and efficient global economic and financial governance. 3. Encourage robust international trade and investment. And 4. Promote inclusive and interconnected development. Let's look at finding a way forward for global economic growth first. Sustainable innovation, massive public platform, accessible network, revolutionary reform, and technological innovation. The Smart Innovation Initiative is a concept proposed by the B20 to encourage more innovation and entrepreneurship. They're also hoping to find ways to fund more infrastructure investment by encouraging development banks to enable private sector infrastructure investment. They also see great potential in green financing and digital technology. Number 2 is to develop more effective and efficient global economic and financial governance. Nearly a decade after the global financial crisis, this is still a major talking point. The B20 are keen to strengthen intergovernmental cooperation against corruption and anti-corruption compliance. They want to optimize global financial regulations and adopt consistent and aligned tax policies to drive inclusive growth. The world is so interconnected now, and the B20 are also keen to focus on driving more international trade and investment. They propose eliminating new protectionist measures while rolling back existing ones to enable trade growth. They also see a lot of potential in the concept of Electronic World Trade Platform, or EWTP, to promote more cross-border electronic trade. And finally, they want to promote inclusive and interconnected development by removing structural barriers to increase youth employment and encourage more women to join the labor market. They also want to help educate and train those people and will look at how they can fill any potential gaps in the workforce.
Welcome back to the studio discussion here. Ning and Weiwen, what do you think of the presentation by President Xi Jinping at the opening ceremony of the B20?
Well, I think I have 3 major takeaways from President Xi's presentation. I think the first is confidence. I think President Xi not only mentioned his confidence with Chinese economy, he's also quite confident with how China can set an example for not just emerging economies, but also some of the developed economies to revitalize the global economic growth. So I think that is one major takeaway I have from his presentation. The second, I think, is cooperative. I think he mentioned about how I think China has learned quite a lot from the West, and also how China is getting more and more integrated into the global financial markets and the global economy. So I think there's greater communication, and I think a greater level of cooperation is required for pushing the global economy to be in more sustainable and more, encouraging growth. The third, I think, is green. We have heard this word a lot in both the business of the B20 summit and also in China's agenda for the G20 summit meeting about how to make the global economic growth more sustainable, not just from an economic perspective, but also from an environmental and from an earth perspective. So that's my primary takeaways from President's presentation.
Weiwen, your take?
Yes, I have some impressions. The first, President Xi Jinping made it crystal clear that we must put the world growth on the track based on innovation-driven and the structural reforms instead of the short-term stimulus by fiscal or monetary policies. That's the first one. Only this can sustain a world growth. Second is the open business, open trade and investment, not only for China but also for the world. We have to fight protectionism and adhere to the multilateral trade system, encourage cross-border investments, including infrastructure investments. Not only for other countries, but China. He also said China will adhere to the open policy and will further open our door to foreign international community. The third point is development. Put development on the agenda. That's converged to the UN 2030 agenda. That is, more countries should be involved to make development shared and enjoyed by all the people.
There has been extensive media coverage about the importance of G20 as well as the B20, of course. But one thing that impressed me most is, for the first time, so many developing country representatives have been invited by the host country to address the issue of development. How important is that for those who follow the process here in Hangzhou?
Well, I think it is extremely important. I think the importance of emerging economies cannot be overstated. Well, if you look at the size of the economy, it is still being dominated by the developed economies too. But if you look at the contribution that has been made to global economic growth, emerging economies have been steadily making more than half of the economic growth in the entire world growth over the past 8 years, ever since the global financial crisis. So I think that is very important. Not only is the size or the momentum of the emerging economy very important, it is also very important to bear in mind that I think emerging economies, I think especially China, has been pushing forward in areas such as technology innovation and business model innovation. So it is not just the developed economies setting the example and precedent and the emerging economies following up. It is now, I think, a two-model growth, two-headed growth model where you have both the developed economies and the emerging economies grow on separate paths, and these two separate paths can help each other. So I think that is becoming a very unique feature of the global economy going forward in the next 1 or 2 decades.
We were present at the opening ceremony of not only B20 but G20 will be representatives of Thailand, which
Yes.
assumes the rotating chairmanship of the Group 77,
Yes.
as well as had from or senior representative from Cairo, Egypt. What
Yes.
do you think of their representation?
I think we have representatives from the Group of 77 and also ASEAN and also African Union and also African Partnership, so on and so forth. They represent the main body of the developing countries. And I think this also, Hangzhou Summit also marks an important change in the mechanism of G20. In the past, we often stress that the G20 accounted for 85% of world GDP, and that's so important. That's the club of big powers. But small countries, developing countries, were neglected. However, there are over 190 member states in the United Nations. So those small countries are also very important in the world growth and the world social security. So if we say that without the sound development of those countries, there would not be any strong, sustainable or balanced world growth.
Yes, indeed, you delivered a very important message about why small and medium-sized developing countries or organizations that represent developing countries should not be left marginalized on occasions such as G20, which is meant to address common prosperity. Let me cross over to Roy for his comments on how he feels about the atmosphere and his immediate response to what's going on in Hangzhou, because he's standing by there in this beautiful tourist attraction. Hello, Roy. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I think what I feel is that it is a very inclusive conference. We have actually got more delegates that is attending the event than many other B20 events. And what happened is that there is a very frank discussions and people getting very excited on the fact that B20 is rolling out some of the general principles and at the same time very concrete targets as far as what the future would be. And I think as President Xi mentioned today, this is actually looking at for a structural change of the way that people develops. Is no longer, in particular for China, is no longer, going to be simply relying on cheap labor, manufacturing, and we are looking at innovation and development on many other areas like e-commerce and internet-related business.
What should the G20 member states do to tackle problems you mentioned? Roy?
I think what I think it would be the main theme is that the G20 countries should be more inclusive. They should be looking at new ways to conduct their business. Their business environment has changed a lot. The use of internet, the fintech, the e-commerce area is developing, and it all get to create a lot of challenges for governments. And the G20 should actually focus and keep the momentum on and actually tackle the issues and deliver the results.
Thank you very much. That's Roy standing by in Hangzhou. Juning and Wei Wen, do you think, we live in the age of digital technology. Do you think this serves as a catalyst for the development in developing countries, or rather the digital gap is widening between developed and developing nations?
Well, I think it can cut in both ways. I think it is definitely a very instrumental technology that will propel certain economies. For example, the city of Hangzhou has taken advantage of the burgeoning growth of Alibaba and fintech group of Ant Financial. So I think
perhaps this is one of the reasons why Hangzhou has been chosen to be the venue for
I think this is
summit.
One opportunity for China to showcase its growth and its development with the new technology, with internet and with financial technology. So I think that is definitely one opportunity that is propelling some emerging economy, or at least certain parts of the emerging economy, to catch up or even exceed that of the developed economy. So I think that is a very good way. But then we also have to keep in mind that I think digital technology has one particular and inherent feature that is the winner takes all. I think that feature has been proposed, once internet was given birth like 20 years ago. So I think one player will dominate the entire world is gradually becoming the pattern in China's and in the global economy. We have one search engine, Google. We have one social network company, Facebook, and we now are going to have only one online car booking service, which is Uber, Didi, and Kuaidi. So I think for the G20 leaders and the B20 leaders, I think the delicate balance that have to be struck is how to strike the balance between efficiency and fairness. We're seeing a lot of improvement in efficiency with the emergence of technology, digital technology. But then we have to put more emphasis on those less privileged, less advantaged groups. So I think we want to think harder about how to use digital technology to help those people who cannot be covered, who cannot be helped previously.
Yes, indeed, the leaders from the G20 summit must be wrestling with the issue and discrepancies between effectiveness and fairness. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Zhu Ning and Professor He Weiwen. We're discussing messages that are being delivered from the B20, which is the prelude to the G20 summit opening ceremony in Hangzhou. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back, gentlemen. The keynote presentation of President Xi Jinping at the opening ceremony of B20, as well as the meeting itself, are important. But what is allegedly more newsworthy at this moment is perhaps a signing, a ratification of a very landmark document, that is the Paris Climate Change Agreement, that's been agreed upon by both President Obama and China. It's one of the few huge joint ventures that the two governments are able to sign despite the rising tensions in the South China Sea. So At the same time, many in China who follow the process are very skeptical as to whether the divided Congress in the United States will be able to sign or ratify this very important document so that the two governments can coincide and coordinate their efforts to protect the world in terms of sustainability. What do you think of the implications?
I'm not that optimistic in the agreement passed in the U.S. Congress, because if we just take a look back at the Tokyo Protocol, that's very unfortunate. However, whatever the U.S. Congress does, we will move on resolutely. So we approved Paris Accord, and China will, on its part, will do its best to improve in this regard and to cut CO2 emission and to adhere to the green development. I think that China has made great headways in the past few years. Before 2010, China per year contributed on average between 1/3 to 1/2 of the newly added CO2 emissions worldwide. But in the past few years, the portion was reduced considerably, and it was praised by the whole world. I'm sure that the targets President Xi Jinping mentioned that will be met, although there will be practical difficulties, especially regarding to how to make those relevant provinces to address the employment and growth issues.
Last night, Friday night, Beijing residents marvel at the afterglow of the beautiful skies, and today we are also blessed by the beautiful blue skies. Increasingly, we see so many blue skies in Beijing and perhaps in areas on the periphery. Is it because of, for example, the bankruptcy of those polluting boilers, turbines in the neighboring provinces of Henan, Hebei, so on and so forth, all the increasing use of e-commerce, and the overcapacity is being reduced at the same time. But what's going to happen next?
Well, I think we're going to see probably a gradual and painful transition from the old economy into the new economy. Yes, I think we have seen a lot of news covering about the closing of many of the plants in the concrete industry, in the coal mines, and in the steel and iron industry. So I think that's definitely going to contribute to the improvement in Beijing's weather and climate. But let's not forget, I think China in the past 3 years set up 7 newly established environmental exchanges. Those exchanges largely focus on the exchange of CO2 emission rights. And that is trying to use the market force to make people more conscious about their CO2 emission, and also try to use more efficient way of trying to be friendly to environment. And another thing I want to mention is, the digital economy is not necessarily by itself a greener economy. I think it's more about, the entire society has to be more conscious about, we want to be more healthier or more environmental friendly with our own lifestyle, try to ride more bicycle and ride less cars. So things like that. So I think it's a gradual process, and that process probably not going to be very encouraging to GDP growth. However, I think that it's going to strike a much better balance in terms of the quality of the development and the growth speed.
Development of financial industry is prioritized on the agenda of President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang in the hope of restructuring the economy. Yes, Friday night, as I said earlier, many in Beijing marvel at the afterglow of the sunset to appreciate the beautiful skies, the blue skies. And now, at the same time, do you think the industries of coal, steel, and cement should be viewed as sunset industries? Because the real economy has to be taken very seriously. If you look at the size of a population and the large labor force in this developing country, the biggest among all.
There have been really no sunset industries since the civilization of human society. There will be no dying of coal, steel industries ahead. The important thing is how they change. So the coal, for instance, there will be a clean coal industry. And even in the coal burning power plant, we can have very clean coal burning that was zero emission. even in steel industry. For instance, I read over a piece of stories at the Nanjing Steel Group. They wanted to transform it fundamentally. So in 5 years, they will have a clean steel, even with the increase of their revenue. So that will be a fundamental change. So we do not say that industries are dying. They are not dying. They are changing. They are upgrading to the modern industries.
Professor Zhu, nowadays global FDI, foreign direct investment flows, have not returned to the pre-crisis level for one reason or another and remain volatile. What are the major reasons? Is the risk the main worry, and how is that affecting global economic growth prospect?
Well, I think China is probably on the top of the list. I think China used to have really, really high FDIs from other countries. With rising costs and I think the growing domestic industry, I think FDI into China has been gradually coming to a plateau. I think that is one major reason. The second is, at the same time, while China's FDI is not growing as much, China's ODI has increased quite a lot, but it is not growing as much as we or Chinese have wanted. I think that is having something to do with the protectionism from more developed economies. I think Chinese enterprises are trying very hard to collaborate or acquire business in the US, in Europe, but I think they have been facing an increasing amount of resistance and reservations. So I think that is also one way of the new so-called protectionism, not necessarily taking place in the areas of trade, but probably in the area of investment and capitalism.
Let's look at the financing vehicles in the process of a global economic recovery, particularly in terms of the small and medium-sized enterprises. The small and the medium-sized enterprises generate half of the gross domestic product in the G20 members, and they account for 3/4 of formal employment and create 8% of the net job growth. But access to finance has been a very important and devastating problem for these SMEs. What do you think should be done to solve this problem?
I think this is an old problem. We have been talked for decades. But the important thing is not to stress that it's very important, but to find out the real tools and practical methods. I think one of the factors, among others, we should, first of all, the SMEs or the new launching enterprise themselves should adhere to the good technology, innovative technology. You should not seek a very big company, but seek a very strong company with a unique technology with a cutting competitive advantage. So in this sense, you don't worry about getting money. You will get money. For instance, in Germany, once I worked in Germany in the 80s, there are many small companies who exported wonderful goods in the world. They were called invisible champions. So they were not worried about getting money. They could get money. On the other hand, the government should do something. They should provide additional financial support with the policy banks with a discount interest rate providing to those small and medium companies. And they should also set up a special organ to guarantee for their credit, for their loans. For instance, if we just leave it to commercial banks, the commercial banks, for their own risks, will not do that. So the government should get in.
The last question is very much about trade protectionism the world over. Not only multinationals in China complain that their golden days are over in terms of how to look at the level playing field, but it seems China is part of the current campaign for protectionism. We adopt more trade restrictive measures. So what do you think of the concerns about protectionism as the prospect of global protectionism is on the rise? Without continued investment and trade and the stagnation in advanced economies and growth, deceleration in emerging economies is likely to broaden. Can China mitigate the rising global protectionism?
Well, I think that's a very challenging task. I mean, China has been on the forefront of, trying to promote more free trade, at least from the emerging economies perspective. But I think China is facing its own share of the challenges because of the rising costs and also because of the structuring reform that's going on in China. So I think probably two things are worth mentioning. One is I think free trade is in the interest of almost everyone. I mean, at least we're talking about the major economies. So that is still the essential part of a healthy and growing global economy. So I think that is very important. Second is, I think from emerging markets perspective, I think emerging markets are largely the victim, not the beneficiaries of protectionism. So in some way, I think the emerging markets should work together, maybe with China being its representative, to promote or to push forward a freer and more inclusive trade environment in the entire world.
The EU, for example, vows to ban more of the steel exports from China. And that's part of the effort of trade protectionism,
yes,
to be held responsible for the electorate who shares growing concerns about how their local industries should be better protected. What do you think of the current disputes in this area?
Well, this is really a big concern, because I think that one of the major reasons is the poor economic situation in European Union, because they have overcapacity in steel production, so they just want to build a wall against the imports from China. So in this way, on the one side, we should fight protectionism, negotiate with the EU not to do that, or reduce your barriers. That's one thing. And the other is we try to seek cooperation with the European steel industry, just as what we had done a few years ago in the photovoltaic industry.
The last issue is very much about what President Obama says about the rule setting. He says it's the United States which should be the country to write the rules, not countries like China. When we look at trade protectionism and the trade regime, multilateral ones, what do you think of the impact of President Obama's threat, if not political will, on their side?
I quite doubt whether the United States is even able to make rules now, because the TPP now seems to be in a deadlock, and TTIP seems to be in a very difficult situation. And also both candidates from the GOP or from the Democrats opposed NAFTA. They want to rewrite NAFTA and also want to change WTO. So in that case, what rules they are seeking? They want to say that all the rules in international trade deals must be good for the US. There's no such a rule.
Perhaps
There's for US only.
Reasons.
So we doubt. So China should work work with the US, with all the other countries, and with WTO to adhere to push forward globalization and free trade mechanism.
Perhaps that is one of the reasons why Vice Chancellor of Germany and Economic Minister Mr. Sigmar Gabriel says recently that current negotiations between the two sides across the Atlantic Ocean about TTIP have basically failed. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue, talking about the G20. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.